Okay, next question. What did Silk have to do with connecting East Asia to Western Europe? Dallin.
So silk was just an awesome, precious commodity that people really wanted, but the only place where it was created was in China. And when places farther east got the stability to focus on growing their civilizations in terms of things like fashion and clothing and stuff like that, the demand for silk was created farther to the west, like in the Roman area and stuff. And so the Silk Road, where they would take that stuff to transport, connected the world zone in a way that it hadn't been connected before.
Yeah, it created a global system for trade, right? Yeah, Jared, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it also sort of, I mean, it was one of the first main trade routes, and so it sort of led to all of the other trade that eventually began to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so you can see here the famous Silk Road is this one that we see here. Okay, you can see this is kind of the famous initial Silk Road, and you can still see elements of this Silk Road today, which is pretty cool. But you also have, you know, roads that come off of that for trade. You know, roads down into Persia and so forth, and of course you've got your shipping systems. And so it was easier to exchange via road systems, but at other times in history, depending on the geopolitical situations and marauders and so forth, sometimes it was easier to take things by boat. But it did create the Silk Roads created, or the exchange of silk more specifically, created a more and more global system. And it's funny how one fabric did that. Now, that doesn't mean other things weren't exchanged along the way. Lots of things were exchanged along the way. Metalwork was another major exchange that Europe kind of sent east in a lot of ways, because the Europeans were more advanced in their metalwork, and often China was more advanced in its pottery making and things like that, and Central Asia more advanced in those areas. Rug making was very much a part of the economy of Persia, for example, and it was sent both directions. So all of these kind of peoples along the way had their means of exchange and had their products that they were selling, but just by selling all of this stuff, we create a global system. And what does this do for collective learning? Pretty basic, simple question, but what does it do? Let's go ahead, Jeannie.
Kind of my thought process for it is that because, like, the Silk Road opened up Rome to China and stuff like that, and like you said, they traded much more things than just silk. So some things that can be traded is also information and ideas and things like that. So for collective learning, it really opened up some big channels that could be worked through and stuff like that.
Yeah, good. You know, so often when we think of empires, we think of what? When you think of an empire, what's kind of the first things that come to mind? For me, anyway, it's war, right? Like, it's expansion, it's war, it's Alexander the Great, and you know, the Romans conquering the Greeks, and yeah, tyranny, exactly, and it's the power, right? It's those things. That's what we think of. But what we don't realize, is that these same empires advanced collective learning. So despite their many faults, and they had many, and the horrible things that they did to certain peoples, and their bloodthirst and all of those things, despite all this, they also had to foster these empires and had to make these empires work. And that created a vast infrastructure and built networks of exchange, and therefore a greater network of collective learning, or a more dynamic network for collective learning, right? Because the more quickly you can move information, the more that collective learning can progress forward. Okay, Celine, go ahead.
I was just also going to add to that. Also, the way that I was kind of thinking about it was, and I don't know if this is accurate per se, but with all the different empires that, you know, before like the collapse of civilization or whatever, but before that time, a lot of the empires were kind of equal and kind of started getting really competitive with each other in kind of a symbiotic way, very much like capitalism and like different businesses competing with each other. And because of that, all the different empires had to become more progressive in the way that they were thinking and had to come up with new ideas and different things like that, which kind of pushed them past, you know, just the normal thinking that they had previously.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic point. Thanks for that. Wyatt, go ahead.
Back to the reading, I just thought we're talking about collective learning's effects in this kind of atmosphere of the trading. Not only does the size matter, the sheer size of these empires as they're trading information, but the diversity also. You can see these completely different cultures that developed worlds away and literally their own kind of thought processes and different kinds of ways of exchanging. You could just see this kind of idea and diversity of ideas flowing back and forth between each other, enhancing collective learning astronomically, not just the amount of size that's going and all the potential connections in that size, but also the amount of ideas and the quality and diversity of them that's being exchanged. So that just like sets collective learning forward hundreds of years just by connecting these completely different worlds of these people.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Lace, go ahead.
Also, these empires created a lot of competitiveness. Like, each empire or little civilization was trying to figure out a way to make their infrastructure better, how to make stronger steel. How can I able to flank this person? How am I able to get a sleight of hand? You know, those sort of things. All trying to get a little better so they can beat one another.
Yeah. Yep. An exchange of those ideas and processes helps everyone. Yeah. Jared, go ahead.
I like what Laith said, and it sort of reminded me of, I guess, a more applicable example to our day. Like, look at sort of during the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans and the space race that they got into. And it was because of this competition that we actually started getting into space and finding all this amazing technology. So it sort of shows what competition can do. I mean, it may not be super positive, but I mean, look where it's gotten us.
Yeah, and the competition between these states, the desire to get militarily ahead, and then the results of that, you know, like one of the videos talks about simply once iron was developed and used for weapons, you know, those civilizations had an advantage. But once they turned those weapons into plows and started using metal plows, they became that much more advanced in their agriculture as well. So there are, throughout history, one of the driving forces, one of the major driving forces, not the only, but major driving forces of technology or the development of technology is war. It is that competitiveness and wanting that strategic or competitive advantage over your neighbors. You know, if you can have, and think of, you know, if you develop the gun first or the cannon first, you've got an advantage. You know what I mean? So yeah, that competition really mattered. It really does. Let's apply it to today, okay? Because we kind of see a similar thing going on, but instead of, you know, civilization to civilization or empire to empire, we see it more amongst corporations today. Corporations own patents. And the thing about that is if they own a patent, no one else can recreate that same product, even if the other company is doing nothing with that patent. And so it creates kind of a funky situation here. So you got all these corporations that are competitive and wanting to buy up patents, and oftentimes they buy up patents that they don't even want to use, but they just want it for themselves so no one else can use it. Okay, Apple and what's it called, Samsung are famous for doing that, and they're in constant battles with each other for it. They'll buy up technologies that they don't even plan to use, but they just don't want their competitor to be able to use it. And so on one side, you want to be the one that's doing all the R&D, research and development, and creating the new patents. On another side, it limits collective learning by limiting who can use those patents and use that technology. And it's funny how in ancient times you kind of see the same thing. You have on one side people's creating all these new technologies to get advantages, and those technologies eventually get leaked and other people end up using them. But you also wanted to be kind of ahead of the game and didn't want people to know how to build a cannon or how to build this or how to do that weapon in this such a way. If it gave you an advantage, you didn't want anyone to know about it. So there's always kind of like this battle between competitiveness, creating or like limiting collective learning, but also enhancing it because of the competition, because you want to have the advantage. And it's funny how there's kind of this back and forth in that throughout history. Blake, go ahead.
Perfect example of this in these ancient times for this competitive patent thing. In olden times, glass was very hard to make, and to manufacture glass at any scale of mass production was extremely valuable. In the Italian peninsula, they had a dedicated island for manufacture for all the glass makers.
Yeah.
For two reasons. One, so they weren't able to leave the island and tell their secrets of their glass factory. And also kind of safety reason, because making glass kind of ends up in explosions.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We could spend literally a semester on just that concept of how economically, in terms of collective learning, competition both creates and advances technology and limits it. It's funny how that is. It has like the symbiotic relationship that it has within itself. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff. And again, by the way, we're seeing the same thing today. Now, can anyone think of companies that on purpose do the opposite of this? They release everything. There's quite a few of them out there. Quite a few of them. Probably no, Windows doesn't. Although Windows allows their system to be open and anyone to develop programs for it, and eventually Apple with the iPhone and so forth with apps developed a similar strategy. But Linux is a system that's completely open source, and anyone can manipulate the Linux system and do whatever they want with it. There's lots of companies out there that really believe in doing the same thing. They want to use everything they do as open source and release that to the public, because then the public will in turn on their own improve it and improve the overall quality of the system. My brother-in-law works with a databasing company that does exactly that. Every advancement that they do is open source, and they allow anyone and everyone to look at it and use it. Now, they create unique versions of it to solve specific problems for certain companies, and so those companies get exclusive access to a design that is, designed for their company, but because it's designed for their company, it wouldn't be particularly useful to anyone else. But all of the general advancements of their databasing software is given to anyone and everyone who wants to use it. It's pretty fascinating stuff. It is a trend that's happening in the world of business, and kind of there's the struggle between open source and non-open source. Another good example of that is Firefox, which is an open source browser, as opposed to, let's say, Safari or Chrome that's not open source. Okay. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to point out the Han Chinese, the Kushians, the Parthians, and the Roman Empire, right? You see how that kind of just connects east to west in those four empires? You've got lots of other empires and lots of other groups of people all throughout, but those four have an interconnected road system that really gets this collective learning going at a larger scale.